The bones were never meant to surface. They came up pale and warped from the clay after a winter flood split the hillside open. Skulls collapsed inward like wet paper. Rib cages fused where breath had never learned how to move. Some were small enough to fit in a man's hands. Others were twisted into shapes that suggested the body had given up halfway through becoming human. The earth around them smelled old and sour, as if the ground itself had been holding its breath for decades. The locals said the screams had always been there, not loud, not constant, just enough to be mistaken for wind moving through dead trees or foxes calling to one another across the ravine. But there were nights when the sound carried weight, when it lingered too long to be dismissed. Nights when mothers barred their doors and fathers kept their boots on while they slept. What lay buried in that valley was not a single crime, nor a single family, but a slow collapse that unfolded generation by generation, a bloodline that folded inward until it could no longer remember where it began. Flesh learning to repeat its own mistakes again and again until error became inheritance. Long before anyone thought to look, before papers were filed or names recorded, the mountains closed around a small settlement and kept its secrets. The people who lived there believed isolation was salvation. They believed purity could be preserved by cutting away the world. They believed God listened more closely in places maps forgot. What followed was not sudden. There was no single moment when everything broke. There was only accumulation, marriages that mirrored themselves, children who resembled their grandparents too closely, faces that seemed familiar in unsettling ways, as if the same person were being born repeatedly, each time a little less complete. By the time the first outsiders noticed something was wrong, the damage had already rooted itself deep into bone and blood. The valley had learned to normalize deformity. It had learned to call suffering sacred. It had learned to hide what could not be explained. Before we go any deeper, pause for a moment. Which city are you listening from right now, and what time is it where you are? Some stories change depending on the hour they reach you, because what remains after 7 generations of isolation is not just disease. It is a kind of memory trapped in tissue, a record written into skin, teeth, and malformed limbs, a history that cannot be burned, buried, or prayed away. The story does not begin with discovery, it begins with intention. With a decision made in the late 19th century by people who believed they were protecting themselves from corruption. They did not know they were building a closed system. They did not understand that blood, once trapped, begins to rot, and somewhere deep in the Appalachians, in a valley cut off by stone and winter, that rot was already spreading, quietly, patiently, waiting for the ground to split open. The valley did not appear on most maps, and when it did, it was marked only as an indentation between ridgelines, a blank space where nothing of consequence was meant to exist. The mountains around it rose sharply, their slopes choked with pine and shale, forming a natural barrier that turned weather into a weapon. Snow arrived early and stayed late, roads washed out in spring and were never properly repaired. By design or neglect, the place learned how to keep itself sealed. The first records come from the 1880s, written in brittle ink on church ledgers now browned with age. A small group of families arrived together, led by a man whose name appears repeatedly in the margins, sometimes underlined, sometimes followed by scripture. He preached separation as survival. The world beyond the ridges was unclean, he said, and blood diluted by outsiders was blood lost forever. The faithful listened. They always do at the beginning. They built their homes close together, not out of necessity, but out of doctrine. Marriage was encouraged early. Choice was considered. Dangerous. Love was secondary to obedience. When children were born, they were celebrated not as individuals, but as proof that the valley could sustain itself without interference. In the first generation, the signs were subtle enough to ignore: a child with a limp that never healed correctly, a girl who struggled to learn words the way others did, infants who died in their sleep and were buried quickly before questions could form. These were explained away as God's will, or the price of life in harsh country. By the time the second generation reached adulthood, the family lines had already begun to overlap. Cousins married cousins. Uncles became fathers twice over, though the language used to describe these unions remained deliberately vague. The records, when they existed at all, were careful to obscure relationships, names repeated, dates blurred, parentage dissolved into suggestion. The children born during this period looked different, though no one inside the valley seemed to notice. Fingers appeared where there should have been none. Jaws grew narrow, teeth crowding inward. Some children never learned to walk without assistance. Others stared too long, as if their thoughts moved at a slower, heavier pace. Isolation turned these abnormalities into a shared baseline. When everyone limps, limping becomes normal. When every face carries the same distortions, no one thinks to question the shape of a skull or the spacing of eyes. The valley taught its children that this was simply how people were made. Winters became more severe. Storms collapsed the few trails that connected the settlement to the outside. Supplies dwindled, and when men left to trade or steal what was needed, they returned quickly, fearful of staying too long among strangers. Outsiders asked questions. Outsiders noticed things. Inside the valley, births continued. So did deaths. Graves multiplied at the edge of the tree line, many unmarked, some small enough to be forgotten within a season. The soil grew dense with remains, layer upon layer, as if the land itself were keeping count. It was during the third generation that the first child was born, who could not be explained away at all. The child arrived during a winter that refused to end. Snow pressed against the cabin walls well into spring, and the midwife, an aging woman whose hands shook even at rest, later said she had known something was wrong before the first cry failed to come. The labor lasted too long. The mother screamed until her voice broke, then went silent, staring at the rafters as if listening for permission to survive. When the child was finally pulled free, the room emptied of sound. No one said the name that formed instinctively in their minds. The infant's head was misshapen, the skull bulging in places it should not, the face drawn tight as if stretched over unfamiliar angles. One eye sat higher than the other. The mouth opened but did not cry, drawing in air that seemed uncertain whether to star. They wrapped the child quickly and carried him away from the mother before she could look too closely. Outside, the cold cut through wool and bone alike. Someone whispered a prayer. Someone else whispered that the blood was thinning. The boy survived. He grew slowly, differently. His limbs remained stiff, his gait uneven, but he learned to move well enough to be useful. He spoke late, and when words came, they arrived distorted, as though shaped by a mouth that did not fully understand them. Children his age avoided him without being told to. Adults watched him with an unease they never named. By the time he reached 7, strange habits had formed. He drew in the dirt with sticks, repeating the same symbols again and again, circles folding into themselves, lines that crossed and recrossed until they resembled knotted roots. When asked what they meant, he stared back blankly, then scraped them away with his heel. Animals began to go missing. Chickens first, then goats. Once, a dog was found near the creek, its spine bent at an angle that suggested hands had twisted it experimentally. No one accused the boy directly, but doors began to close when he passed. Mothers pulled their children indoors at dusk. At night, sounds came from the cabin where he slept. Low murmurs, sometimes laughter that did not match the shape of a child's joy. Once, a neighbor swore she heard him speaking in a voice older than his own, repeating phrases no one recognized, as if reciting something G learned before he was born. The elders watched carefully. They told themselves this was a test. Everything in the valley was framed that way. Deformity was faith made visible. Suffering was proof of devotion. To question either was to invite exile, a fate worse than death, in a place where the world beyond the ridges might as well have been another planet. As the boy aged, his resemblance to others in the valley became harder to ignore. He looked like too many people at once. His brow mirrored his grandfather's, his mouth echoed his mother's brother, his hands, with their extra finger curled inward like a secret, matched those of a cousin buried years earlier. Family trees were spoken of less and less. Lineage became a dangerous topic. It was easier to let relationships blur, to pretend everyone was simply related in the abstract, children of the valley rather than of specific unions. By adolescence, the boy no longer attended gatherings. He lingered at the edges, watching. Sometimes he smiled when he should not have. Sometimes he wept without visible cause. The elders met in private, their prayers growing more desperate, their doctrine tightening like a fist. They did not know yet what he represented, only that he was not an ending. He was a beginning. By the time the boy reached his 13th winter, the valley had begun to change its rituals. Gatherings grew quieter, hymns were shortened, verses skipped as if certain words carried weight they could no longer bear. The elders marked doors with chalked symbols meant to ward off impurity, though no one could agree on what impurity now meant. The marks faded quickly in rain and snow, but were always redrawn again and again, as if repetition itself might hold something together. The boy was no longer called by his given name. People referred to him indirectly, a glance, a tilt of the head. Children whispered that he did not sleep, that his eyes remained open in the dark, reflecting firelight long after the flames died. A girl claimed she saw him standing in the creek at night, water lapping at his knees while he traced shapes on his own skin with a stone. Drawings appeared on cabin walls. Not everywhere, only in places where children slept. Crude figures with elongated limbs, faces without mouths, bodies joined at impossible angles. When confronted, the boy said nothing. He only watched as the elders scraped the images away, their hands trembling more than age alone could explain. Animals were no longer just missing. They were found arranged, bones stacked in careful spirals, skulls placed at thresholds, facing inward, as if invited. The elders burned what they could, burying the rest deep beyond the tree line, speaking prayers that sounded more like apologies than praise. It was during this time that visitors began to arrive, not openly, not announced. Men would leave the valley at dawn and return days later with supplies that had not been seen before. Canned goods with unfamiliar labels, fabric too fine for trade. Once a woman noticed a scarf she recognized from a neighboring town, worn briefly by one of the younger wives before disappearing. No one asked where these things came from. Questions had a way of turning inward, looping back on the one who asked them. The boy watched these arrivals closely. He followed the women brought in under cover of night, their faces pale with confusion and fear. Some were gone by morning, some remained and were never quite themselves again. As the boy matured, his body continued to betray itself. His spine curved sharply, his speech regressed, words dissolving into sounds that seemed almost deliberate in their refusal to become language. Yet his eyes sharpened. He understood more than he could express, sometimes more than anyone wanted him to. The elders began to consult him, not directly, not openly, but they listened when he reacted. They observed which pairings made him restless, which seemed to calm him. Over time, patterns emerged. Certain unions produced fewer stillbirths. Others resulted in children who lived, however briefly. The valley adjusted accordingly. Family lines folded tighter. Relationships that would have once been unthinkable became necessary. Mothers became wives to men who shared their blood. Sisters bore children for brothers. The language used to describe these arrangements softened, wrapped in scripture and necessity. Survival demanded sacrifice. God demanded obedience. Screams return. Ed to the night, louder now, more frequent. Women labored alone, hidden away until outcomes could be assessed. Infants deemed unviable were not named. Their bodies were carried to the woods before dawn, laid into shallow earth that barely pretended to keep them. The boy stood at the center of it all, not as a leader, but as a mirror. What the valley had become was reflected in his warped frame, in his unblinking gaze, in the way he seemed to recognize each new child as an iteration rather than an arrival. By the time the truth could no longer be avoided, it had already written itself into every living body in the valley. The revelation did not arrive as a confession. It surfaced the way rot does, through smell first, then texture, then the slow understanding that something foundational had been compromised long ago. It began with a birth that could not be hidden. The child was delivered at dusk, in the largest cabin near the meeting house. Too many people were present. Too many eyes saw what should never have been seen. The infant's body was fused in ways that defied the valley's practiced denial. 2 spines braided into one torso, limbs sharing joints, a face that carried the unmistakable features of 3 living adults at once. The mother did not scream. She only whispered a name that belonged to her brother. The room froze. No scripture came to mind quickly enough. No prayer could seal what had been exposed. The elders moved to separate those present, but it was too late. 8. Recognition spread with terrifying speed. Faces turned pale as people traced familiar lines in the infant's skull, mapping cheekbones and jawlines back through memory. The father stepped forward last. He was also the mother's uncle, and her son. The family tree, long blurred and deliberately obscured, collapsed inward completely. Relationships once disguised by titles and ritual were suddenly undeniable. Mothers had been daughters, wives had been sisters, children were born carrying the same bloodline twice, sometimes 3 times over, their bodies struggling under the weight of repetition. The boy watched silently from the corner of the room. In his face, the truth had always been visible. He was not an anomaly, he was a prototype. What the valley had normalized, what it had sanctified, had finally exceeded its ability to explain itself away. This was no longer God's test, it was arithmetic. Blood added to itself until it could no longer divide cleanly. Panic spread unevenly. Some fell to their knees, begging forgiveness. Others grew violent, turning on the elders who had arranged the unions, who had spoken of purity while breeding collapse. Records were dragged from hiding places and fed to fire. Pages crackled, names erased in smoke, as if lineage itself could be burned away. The church bell rang through the night, not to gather but to warn. Outsiders were coming, or worse, God was leaving. Animals were slaughtered in ritual desperation, blood soaked into fire. Ozone ground already heavy with it. Houses were marked for cleansing, then set alight when cleansing failed. Flames climbed cabin walls, illuminating faces twisted with fear and recognition. The boy was taken away before dawn. Some say the elders meant to kill him, others say they meant to protect him. No one agrees on what happened beyond the ridgeline, only that he never returned. What remained in the valley was not silence, but aftermath. Children who could not walk, women who could not stop bleeding, men who no longer knew which names they were allowed to speak. The incest had not begun with that night, but it had been named then fully, and naming it shattered what little structure remained. By the time outsiders finally arrived, they would not be discovering a secret. They would be excavating a ruin. The first response came not from law, but from rumor. Nearby towns spoke in lowered voices of a valley where houses had burned without lightning, where livestock vanished, where faces appeared in the woods that looked almost human, but not entirely finished. Hunters avoided the area. Surveyors marked it as unstable ground and moved on. The mountains did their work well, absorbing noise, erasing paths, keeping the damage contained. Years passed. Children grew into adults carrying bodies that betrayed them at every step. Spines curved further, speech thinned, eyes clouded early, birth slowed, then surged unpredictably, each new child an uncertain repetition of the last. The valley existed in a state of suspended decay, no longer expanding, unable to collapse fully. It took a single breach to change everything. In the early 1980s, a storm tore through the region with uncommon violence. Trees uprooted, fences collapsed. A section of the ridge trail, long considered impassable, slid away entirely. When morning came, one of the valley's youngest members was gone. She had been born with a twisted leg and a jaw that never aligned properly, but her mind remained clear. For years she had listened. She had watched the elders hide books and papers. She had learned that the world beyond the mountains was not poison but possibility. When the storm broke the perimeter, she walked until her feet bled, guided only by the belief that anything was better than remaining. She reached a road just before dawn. Her story sounded impossible. A community of hundreds living without records, marriages enforced between relatives, children born malformed and hidden away. Investigators dismissed her at first, attributing her account to trauma or confusion, but the details she provided were too specific, names repeated too often, physical descriptions too consistent. An expedition followed. What they found exceeded even her account. Nearly every inhabitant bore visible signs of genetic damage. Some could not speak. Others communicated through gestures and sounds unique to the valley. Medical teams documented conditions rarely seen outside textbooks. Many a P ring together in the same individual. Some deformities had no classification at all. Behind one of the larger cabins, they discovered a structure locals referred to only as the quiet house. Inside were children who had never been registered as alive. Some were restrained to prevent injury. Others lay still, their bodies incapable of movement. Care had been minimal. Survival, when it occurred, was accidental. The investigation struggled to establish identities, names recycled, birth dates estimated, relationships impossible to chart cleanly. An old Bible surfaced, its margins crowded with notes that avoided specifics. Phrases like "child of the valley" appeared where parentage should have been recorded. One woman spoke more clearly than most. She described how marriages were assigned, how girls were paired as soon as they bled, how refusal was treated as betrayal. She explained, without emotion, that her husband was her cousin, her uncle, and her nephew in different ways, depending on which generation one traced. The elders resisted cooperation. They spoke of tradition, of strength, of blood kept pure against a corrupt world. The contrast between their words and the bodies around them was unmistakable. As records were gathered and remains excavated, it became clear that the valley was not an accident. It was a system. The researcher arrived without announcement, carrying only a battered briefcase and the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being too late. He had begun his work years earlier, cataloguing forgotten communities, places that existed in footnotes and missing person reports but nowhere else. When the valley appeared in his files, it was as an anomaly. Too many disappearances clustered too tightly, too many shared physical descriptions across decades, patterns that suggested inheritance rather than coincidence. What he found in the collected samples unsettled him deeply. Photographs taken during the evacuation showed repeating facial structures across age groups that should not have resembled one another so closely. A child's jaw matched that of a woman in her 60s. A teenager's eyes mirrored those of a man buried before he was born. When genetic material was finally analyzed, the results defied expectation. The degree of shared DNA surpassed thresholds considered survivable in human populations. Some individuals shared more than 2/3 of their genetic material with multiple relatives simultaneously. Roles collapsed. Mother and sister ceased to be distinct categories. Father and uncle blurred into a single genetic presence. The bloodline had looped so tightly that variation had nearly vanished. Archive documents recovered from the elders' quarters deepened the horror. Clippings from old newspapers, academic articles on heredity and recessive traits, notes written in the margins, calculating outcomes, discussions of which unions produced fewer visible deformities, which combinations resulted in children who could orc. Ignorance had not been the engine of this decay. Control had. The founder's personal effects told a quieter story. Genetic markers found in preserved hair and bone revealed that the valley's collapse may have begun before the first cabin was built. Rare conditions already present in the original bloodline had been concealed, not cured, by isolation. The decision to withdraw from the world had not been spiritual alone. It had been strategic. In a sealed basement beneath the meeting house, journals surfaced, written by women across generations. Their language shifted over time. English slowly eroded into a dialect shaped by isolation and repetition. The entries described births, deaths, and doubts that could never be spoken aloud. Some confessed attempts to flee. Others described acts of mercy carried out in secret when infants were born without lungs, without mouths, without the capacity to endure a single night. One entry questioned whether God still watched the valley, or whether he had turned away long ago. As the research expanded, so did the ethical weight of it. These were victims, undeniably. But they were also participants, enforcers of a system that devoured its own children. Responsibility became difficult to assign. Where did coercion end and choice begin? In a place where choice had never been taught. When the excavation near the cemetery began, the ground answered. Hundreds of remains lay beneath the soil, layered by decade. The older bones showed deviation. The newer ones bore evidence of collapse so severe it bordered on the unrecognizable. The trajectory was clear. Each generation had inherited not only genes, but permission to continue. The researcher recorded everything: photographs, measurements, samples. He knew the valley would be closed again soon, transformed into something safer, quieter. But what it had revealed could not be resealed. The damage had already entered the archive. By the time winter returned, the valley was empty. The survivors were scattered into institutions, hospitals, and supervised housing units, whose walls felt impossibly far apart to people raised in cabins that pressed close for warmth and control. Some adapted slowly, overwhelmed by light, noise, and the simple cruelty of choice. Others never adjusted at all, their minds unable to reconcile a world where blood no longer dictated destiny. Medical examinations confirmed what the records had suggested. Nearly every individual carried multiple genetic disorders linked directly to repeated consanguinity. Children bore the heaviest burden. No two cases were identical, yet all traced back to the same narrowing pool of inheritance. Surgeons corrected what they could. Therapists taught what had never been allowed to develop. Much of the damage remained permanent. Legal systems struggled to keep pace with reality. Birth certificates had to be invented, ages estimated, crimes evaluated without precedent. The elders who retained full cognitive capacity faced charges not for belief, but for enforcement, for arranging unions they knew would harm, for hiding knowledge while presenting it as divine will. Most were never tried. The law requires clarity. The valley had produced only blur. In the years that followed, the site itself was altered. Cabins were dismantled. The quiet house was torn down board by board. The cemetery was documented, then sealed beneath a protective barrier. A small marker was placed at the trailhead, its wording careful, almost apologetic. It spoke of isolation, of loss, of remembrance, without naming what had truly occurred. Research continued. Advances in genetic sequencing allowed scientists to map the deterioration across 7 generations with unsettling precision. Mutations compounded, redundancies multiplied. Some combinations had never been documented before, their existence dependent on conditions no ethics board would ever permit. The valley became a case study cited in hushed academic circles, a reminder of how quickly humanity can fold in on itself when unchecked. A few survivors chose to speak publicly years later. Their accounts varied. Some expressed anger, others confusion. A handful spoke of gratitude for a world they never believed existed. One, a former child who had once drawn symbols in dirt, went on to study genetics, dedicating his work to understanding the damage done in the name of purity. He spoke once, at a conference, of inheritance as responsibility, of knowledge as the only antidote to repetition. He did not mention the valley by name. The land remains quiet now. Trees have reclaimed the clearings. The soil holds what it was given. To an untrained eye, it is just another stretch of mountains, indifferent and enduring. But beneath the ground, the record remains intact. Bones remember, blood remembers. The shape of what happened there has not vanished. It has only settled, and it waits, not to be repeated, but to be recognized. There is a question that never appeared in the records, though it lingers between every line. It is not legal, it is not scientific, it is not something the valley ever allowed itself to ask. What would you do if you discovered that the woman who carried you was also your sister, that the man who raised you was also your uncle, that your body, your face, your voice were not accidents of chance, but consequences of decisions made long before you were born? For many of the survivors, this realization arrived late, after names had been assigned and histories reconstructed. They studied family trees that collapsed inward like burned paper. Lines doubled back, branches vanished. In some cases, there was no language left to describe relationship at all. Only repetition. Therapists described a particular kind of grief that followed. Not grief for a single loss, but for an entire lineage that had been denied the possibility of difference. People mourned the versions of themselves that had never been all owed to exist. Bodies that might have formed differently, minds that might have unfolded without constraint. The valley did not create monsters in the way folklore prefers. It created mirrors. Each generation reflected the last, with less distortion of belief and more distortion of flesh. What began as doctrine ended as anatomy. The most disturbing truth uncovered by researchers was not the extremity of the deformities, but their predictability. Given the same conditions, the same choices, the same isolation, the outcome would always converge toward collapse. The human body is resilient, but it is not infinite. Diversity is not decoration, it is structure. Today, the case is cited quietly when discussing closed systems, ideological isolation, and the dangers of sanctifying blood over humanity. It is referenced when missing persons are re-examined, when communities refuse oversight, when children disappear behind doctrine and geography. Nothing supernatural was ever required to explain what happened in that valley. No curse, no possession, only time, repetition, and the refusal to look outward. The mountains still stand. They always will. They did not judge. They only contained. And somewhere, in archives and laboratories, in medical journals and sealed boxes of photographs, the record persists. A reminder that when a family tree folds in on itself for too long, it stops being a tree at all. It becomes a grave. What would you do, knowing this? If you traced your own blood far enough back and found it looping where it should have branched,